My name is Van Wesley Hogue. I go by Wes Hogue. I was born in 1955 in Siloam Springs, Arkansas. That was the nearest hospital at that time. That was on September 3rd, 1955. They spanked my bottom at the hospital and they sent me home to a little farm outside of Gentry on Robin Road, what is known today as Robin Road. At that time, it didn't even have a name. My parents, I was sired by my father, Jack Hogue, and my mother, Lucille Hogue. They were both grew up here. They were both moved here as children with their parents. And Jack Hogue grew up on the farm where I was sent home to. We were living on the family farm. They were living on the family farm at the time I was born. And my mother grew up. Her father had passed away when she was a young child, and her mother had remarried, and they moved to Gentry in 1932. My father moved here around 1924. My mother moved here around 1932. Uh, and I went to school in Gentry just in the first grade. After I was born in 1955, my father was employed by a chicken plant, and he wasn't getting very many hours. He had a family to support, and the economics in this area at that time were pretty poor. Not a whole lot of work going on, and so he made the decision to go back into the military. He had served in the military in the Second World War. He went back into the military so he could support his family, have good health care. So I grew up in the military as an Army brat, moving from base to base, and I would come back to Gentry every summer and spend the summer with Grandma. And at times when my father was overseas, if he did a year in Korea, we would come here and live at the family home with my grandmother while my father was overseas. So that's basically the story of my early beginnings, was growing up in the military. Uh, I moved back here around 1981. My parents were getting older, and most of the family had moved away, and so I moved back to kind of help them out in any way I could. Everybody needs somebody around to help them out a little bit when they get old, and eventually I became their caregivers until their death, and I had the advantage and the wonderful opportunity to know my parents as adults, and they passed on an awful lot of stories about the area because they had been here since they were young children. So I know a lot of things about the area that I didn't necessarily experience myself, but it's secondhand knowledge passed down to me from my parents.
And you had also mentioned earlier, we had talked about it, that you got a lot of knowledge from your grandparents, that both the sets of your grandparents lived here. So tell me about who were your grandparents and what all did they tell you before we talk about your parents?
Okay, well, my grandparents, my grandfather was Wes Hogue. I was named after my grandfather, Wes, and his wife was Daisy. Those are my paternal grandparents, my father's parents. And I didn't know my grandfather. He died in 1958 when I was just three. Uh, and so I knew more about my grandmother, Daisy, his wife. She was actually she performed on Broadway, and she did some off Broadway stuff back in the early days in the 20s, I believe it was. And then she moved back to Gentry. She lost her voice. She had a stroke, and she couldn't perform anymore. So she moved back to Gentry, and she was from Kansas City originally. Married my grandfather, I guess, in Kansas City. That's where my father was born, and they moved here in 24. And I believe they bought a farm, the farm outside of town. They bought from one of her family members who had owned that farm since, I don't know how early they had owned it, but I know that they bought the farm probably in the 20s. Is whenever they moved back here in 1924. That's when they purchased the farm from a family member, and so I knew more about my grandmother Daisy. And of course, I was a child. I went. Because I was an army brat. We went to Germany when I was a child, and my grandmother had a stroke while we were gone. So I didn't. After we came back, I didn't have a whole lot of interaction with her because she couldn't speak. Uh, but what I know about her is mostly indirect from my father and my mother. Of course, she was just a wonderful grandmother, like everybody's grandmother should be. That's what I remember about Daisy Hogue. She was a wonderful individual and a loving grandmother. My other grandmother, Eula Hogan, and Tom Hogan, uh, my grandfather had passed away when my mother was a child, when she was 6 years old. Her father was killed in an oil field accident, and eventually my grandmother married a friend of the family, Tom Hogan, and they had been living in Oklahoma out by Enid. They moved to Jay, and eventually they ended up moving to Gentry. Tom Hogan passed away in 1959, so I didn't know him very much either, since I was only 4 years old. I have very few memories of both of my grandfathers. My grandmother, Eula Hogan, she was, once again, a wonderful grandmother. But I did have a lot more interaction with her. I got to go fishing with her a lot. Uh, just one of the most wonderful, loving people you could possibly want to know. But at that time, they didn't share a lot of historical memories. Uh, but I didn't know it at the time, but taking me uptown and buying bologna at the carpenter store, those are historic settings now that are gone by the winds. Now the Carpenter building is still there, but those are the memories. My earliest memories are going to the Carpenter store, buying the bologna. I love bologna, and she would buy me the red weenies because I loved hot dogs, and I still do. I have to admit. But my grandparents didn't pass on a whole lot of knowledge other than I saw how they lived. I saw what their values were. They were uh, religious people. They were Christians, attended church often, took me to church at early age, and so that's mostly what I learned from my grandparents is just the lifestyle, how to be respectful, respect for your elders, yes sir, no sir, stand up straight, look people in the eye. Uh, Although it's not historically significant, I think that it's valuable lessons that everybody should learn early in life if you don't want to be considered a heathen.
What about your parents? What are some of the things you learned from the secondhand things you learned?
My parents, they grew up around here. Like I say, my father moved here. He was born in 18, moved here. He was about 6 when he moved here. And he grew up on the farm. And at that time, working on the farm was a lot of hard work. And he would tell me stories about their first car. My grandfather was a mechanic in Kansas City before they moved down here. So the first car, it was owned by a farmer across the street, and his sons had been driving the car, and they had run it out of oil, and so they pulled it back to the barn, and instead of filling it up with oil, all they had was diesel. So they thought, well, that's oil, that'll work. And of course, they filled it up with diesel, and it washed down everything and filled the crankcase with diesel. I'm not talking about the gas tank. They filled the crankcase with diesel, and they locked up the motor. And so there it sat for 6 or 8 months. My father told me eventually. My father went over and asked him, "What are you going to do with that old car?" So he bought the car, I think, for $4, and they took the mule team up the road and they dragged it home with the mule team. And my grandfather, being a mechanic before he moved out of Kansas City, he took it apart. I think my father told me he had $4 in the car. He spent $6 on a gasket and ring and insert set, and so he had like $11 in the car when they finally got it running. Well, it was a car and they didn't need a car, so they kind of chopped off the back and put a bed on it. And they would go around, like at that time, one of the big businesses in town was the Allen Cannery. They had a tomato cannery here. And they would go to the cannery and they would load up all of the rotten tomatoes. They would take them out and sell them to the farmers extremely cheap to feed their hogs, and they got paid $1 a load. And he said at that time sometimes they could make 2 or 3 loads a day. They were making $3 a day hauling tomatoes out of the Allen Cannery plant. And so that's kind of memories he told me about. Was their first car. Him and his dad would use it to make money, hauling rotten tomatoes from the Allen Cannery plant. So that's an example of the type of stories he would tell me. And of course, he would tell me stories later in his years, at the very end of his life, the last 2 or 3 years. He finally opened up and started telling me some stories about whenever he was in the Second War. And it was an emotional time for him, and it still makes me emotional. I don't know if you can tell, but
Yeah.
I get a little emotional talking about my father and his part in the war. Of course, that generation, he was a decorated soldier, combat veteran, uh, but that was typical of that generation. They didn't see themselves as standouts. Uh, they thought they were just doing their job for their country.
Uh, Talk to me about your decision to move back to Gentry and how you eventually got involved in politics, and then talk about that.
Okay. Before I moved back to Gentry, I was living down in Houston, Texas, and I was a young man, and I was on the hunt to make money. I'd been to school, been to mechanic school, and actually I never went to college. I dropped out of college and went to trade school instead. Uh, and I was living down in Houston. I was working at a Ford dealership, and that was about '81, and there was a recession going on, and it affected Houston. It seemed like last, and so I was the last one hired, and even though I'd been working there for 2 or 3 years, I was the last one hired, so I was the first one to be laid off whenever economic downturn finally hit them. Sales went down. Somebody had to be laid off. I was the one that got laid off. So in the effort to look around and say, where do we want to live? We can choose to live anywhere we want. Uh, and I had lived a number of places. I lived up in Washington, Oregon, California. I lived, and in my travels as an Army brat, I lived in Louisiana, Oklahoma. So we had the opportunity to move anywhere we wanted to, but I spoke to my parents and I said, there's nobody living up there. Would it be any benefit to you if I came up there and made my new life up there? And they said, no, it'd be great. They'd love it. They'd love to have somebody around to help them. And so that's how we made the decision, was mostly because nobody else was living around here. And we had made, my wife and I had made the decision that, well, this is the opportunity to move closer to the folks and, not only get to see them on a regular basis, but help them out any way that we could. That's how the decision was made for that. Now, once I moved up here, I worked in mostly what my trade was, which was auto parts. But then I got on at a factory over in Siloam Springs, a Delco plant, Delco factory. They made pressure washer machines, and I worked for them for, I don't know, about 10 years until I started my own business. And I was able to save enough money working at that job that we started our own businesses. I started a tattoo shop, which we're still in business. It's been a wonderful job for us. But and for a person who's engaged in the business of tattooing to consider going into politics is, you have to understand, I knew that the deck was kind of stacked against me, so I didn't have any real expectations of being able to win any significant elections. But as time went on, and I got to know some of the former politicians of town, J.D. Smith was a big influence for me. I became more politically active on a local scene. I was not necessarily politically active in the Republican Party or the Democrat Party. I was not politically active in that way. I was just active in interest for my small town that I'd grown up in. We didn't, the direction it was going, I was not in complete agreement with it. So a small group of us decided that, well, if we don't like the direction, the best course is to get on the city council and try to change the direction. So that's what I did. I ran for council, got elected. After a few years on the council, because I was an outspoken individual, I guess I got a lot of press, and that opened the door for me to run for mayor. Plus the fact that, a lot of the old timers in town already knew me because I lived here practically every summer, so they knew my parents. They knew me growing up as a kid, and I guess they figured they'd take a chance on me, and so I put my name on the ballot, and I managed to squeak out a win. Kind of surprising to me on election night, but that's the way it rolls.
So, talk about your race. You ran against the incumbent mayor, is that correct?
Yes,
So
yes.
the mayor was who, and
Uh,
who else ran?
Yes, whenever I ran for mayor, the incumbent was Bob Abrahamson, who I like very much. Have a lot of respect for him. He did a lot of good work for the city of Gentry. The direction, his philosophy on how small towns should develop was very different from the direction that I saw. The direction that I saw, I believed in preserving the history of the town. I believed in uh, building on the past success of a town, and I had the perception that Bob was more in line with not developing the downtown area, not developing the old historic district, but actually building new construction for all city offices and government buildings and court buildings and things like that in a separate part of town, which would have basically abandoned the old downtown district, which I was opposed to. So that's the main reason I ran, was to help zhuzh up the downtown district And as a result, here we are 20 years later, 25 years later, and the downtown Main Street looks nice. All the sidewalks are nice and clean. We have wonderful street lights up and down the sidewalk. And that was not my only reason for running. We have there's any number of improvements. This library, it's a wonderful library in an old historic building. So my philosophy of preserving the historic value of the town, I wasn't alone in that. It was supported by any number of people in town. That's why I believe I got elected originally, and that's why I believe I continue to get elected, even though I had opponents, sometimes two or three at every election cycle. So evidently the people liked something I was doing. And I learned a lot in a job. It's a wonderful job. It is a real job. There's work there that has to be done. And I just wish that more politicians would pay attention to the job at hand rather than posturing for the next election. But that might be the reason why I lost the election, too.
So let's talk about some of or what was the city like? Not like what it is like now, but what was it like when you what year was it you were mayor, and what was it like when I was mayor in?
I got elected as mayor in 1998. I was on the city council. I took office January 1st, 1999. And what the city was like at that time was the downtown was in disrepair. All of the sidewalks were crumbling. They were mismatched, hodgepodge, because it had been left up to the property owners to rebuild the sidewalks in front of their business. And so you had only maybe one or two or three business owners who had actually gone the extent of repairing the sidewalks. And so you had a mismatch. What was repaired was kind of mismatched and didn't have any organization to it. But most of the sidewalks were crumbling, and it was terrible for people to try to go downtown and shop. And at that time, we still had businesses, but like many downtown, small town main streets, it was falling into disrepair, and that doesn't create a conducive environment for people to want to buy property and do business in that area. So my vision was that we need to fix up the downtown if we have any hope of wanting people to come in, purchase property, and do business here. In the end, like most small towns, it's a long, slow process. You have your ups and downs, and we're still in the process of revitalizing the downtown area. But it is, I would say we haven't done as well as the city of Siloam Springs, but we have done as better than most small towns that take on that task. And Siloam Springs would probably be the first to tell you it's a long-term project, and you've got to be in for the long haul.
Let's talk specifically about the library. The building it's in now, what did it used to be, and where was it before it came here? Just kind of walk me through that whole library.
Well, the library, whenever I took office as mayor, the library was across the street next to the police department, the court building. Very small, one-room library, probably about maybe 1,200 feet was the entire library. And we had an advisory board, the library board, and they were dying to expand their facility, but they knew that it was limited options there. So they had this vision of selecting an historic building on Main Street and choosing that as their project building to build a much bigger, grander library, and hopefully have room to do some historic storage of documents and artifacts from the local community. So that was a vision. It was a vision of the library board, and after a few years of trying to raise money, about 2 or 3 years they had fundraisers and galas, and they managed to pay off the cost of the building, but they had not any construction funds. So they came to me and asked me what could they possibly do to salvage the project, and I said, well, in government, a lot of projects, privately funded projects like this, it's always helpful if the government comes in and gives it the opportunity to put it on the ballot, see if it has public support. If it does, maybe we could make it a public project and have the city pay for it through bonds, at the approval of the citizens. And so we put it on the ballot. They supported it, ran a nice campaign. It was passed overwhelmingly 2-1 by the voters. They wanted to let the bonds. They wanted to build the library. Unfortunately, we were conservative in our estimates, in that we only let the bonds for about $1 million. Actually, it was less than $1 million. I think it was $945,000. Well, it ended up being almost a $2.5 million project, but that was not paid for by the bonds. That was paid for by generous donations from the McKee family and local community businesses. It grew support after it passed at the ballot. It grew huge support, and that's how the project got started. And of course, it was designed by Marlon Blackwell, a wonderful world-renowned architect out of Fayetteville. Did a wonderful job on it. And the politics of the library was a little touchy because that is quite an expensive project for a small town with a limited budget like the city of Gentry. And like most government projects, the funding can be very challenging, and it was. But at the end of the day, we have a wonderful library any small town would be proud to have, and we're very proud to have this library. It's a wonderful feature that is, it's an educational feature that every town should have if they can find the wherewithal.
Now, this building would have been a real center of a real hub, right?
Yeah,
So what was this business and why would people come here?
This business, it was a two-story structure, the biggest structure on Main Street. At that time, the biggest structure in town, and would be for many years, it was the Carl Hardware Building. And the section that we're in, which is the historical side, this was actually a separate from the Carl Hardware. This section over here was actually a dentist's office, maybe a doctor's office at one time. And so this side was leased for private use, whereas the hardware maintained the majority of the building. And at the end of it all came under the hardware. They quit leasing it. That was probably in the 30s and 40s when they were leasing out to dentists and doctors and things like that. And then they brought it all into the hardware. And yeah, the hardware was a huge business in this town. Of course, every small community has to have hardware. We had the advantage of having two hardware stores. We had the Carl Hardware Building, and then we had what is now Ace Hardware, or the Beaver Hardware Company. So we had two hardware companies. It shows you the need for hardware back in the olden days, I guess. This building, they shut down the hardware store about, I don't remember exactly when it was, in the 90s, early 90s, and it sat vacant until the library board started looking it over and made a deal with the owner, Joe Carl, who was still alive at that time, and he made him a wonderful deal. He donated a lot of the money back to the project once he made the sale, and so that's pretty much that was the start of the project. Now, during construction, it was a difficult project, like a lot of government projects are. It was difficult to administer. Controlling the budget was very difficult. Marlon Blackwell was a great project manager, but as the owner, you know, I had plenty of chores to do on the project myself too. So it's a wonderful project, hugely supported by the city, and now that we are building more and more subdivisions, and there's more new population moving in with children. It's my understanding, I was talking to the librarian, and she says their attendance is booming. They're getting more and more members, more and more children come to the library, and that's the purpose, is to get children and everybody, give them the opportunity to read, give them a source, but also we geared it towards some modern technology in the sense that we provide computer services. We have all kinds of modern communication, but we also have tons of the old style books, brick and mortar and books. We can't beat it.
Earlier, we were looking at some of the pictures from back in the day of what this town looked like.
Yes, sir.
People would come in on a Saturday. Talk
Yes, sir.
about that. Maybe your grandmother's or your parents' day.
Well, back in their day, actually, the city of Gentry, now, before I go too far, the city of Gentry now the population is more than it has ever been. But through the years, back between the teens and the 30s, Gentry, I believe, had quite a lot of population. And after the Second World War, they actually lost some population. And I believe that part of that was because in the early days, in my parents' day, back from the 20s to I would say the 20s to the 50s was their heyday. It was more of an agricultural community, so everything was centered around agriculture. After the Second World War, I think that more people sought out economic opportunities in other places. All the youth that were graduating from the high school, they had to move away to get jobs. There was not a lot of work going on. We didn't have the number of plants, and as a result, my father included, a lot of the young people had to leave to find work elsewhere to make a living to support a family. And the only people who really could be permanent residents, so to speak, would be people who own businesses, people who were independently in business, and they didn't require a plant or a job to go to. They had their own job. So those were the long-term residents. A lot of the youth had to move away. Luckily, that all changed. If I can say this quickly, what kind of turned the fortunes of Gentry, not only the railroad, who built the railroad through here in 1890, sometime around 1894, and they're the ones who did the original subdivision plat of the city of Gentry. That's a service they provided for cities all up and down the line. Where there was not a city, they needed to stop to get water. But other than the railroad, the one thing that changed the fortunes, it was a mayor called B.C. Wiles. He was a truck driver, and a great mayor, as far as I can tell, because he didn't make any money at that time, but he spent a lot of time, made trips to Washington. He courted businesses. He's the one that I give the credit to getting the Little Debbie plant here. From what I understand, it was a big fight between the city of Gentry and Siloam Springs where they were going to locate the plant. He ended up winning out, and so we have the Little Debbie snack cake plant here in town. Huge employer, wonderful community-minded business. And then also at that time, that was around 1979 or 1980. And at about the same time as whenever SWEPCO was developing the power plant. So not only did SWEPCO offer a lot of job opportunities, but the Little Debbie snack cakes offered a lot of job opportunities. That seemed to turn the fortunes, and it seemed like that was happening all over northwest Arkansas, and Benton County was the economic times seemed to be turning at that time, which was around the late 70s, early 80s.
Whenever you were mayor,
Sorry.
what issues, local issues, did you deal with besides the library? What were some of the other projects that you were working on?
Well, I would say the main projects that I had, of course, street projects, because until our fortunes had changed with the Little Debbie plant and the SWEPCO plant, the city had a very, very meager budget. Didn't have money to do really. It didn't have two nickels to rub together, is the way I like to characterize it. As we came out of the 90s, even during Bob Abrahamson's time, he was really good at controlling the budget. He was really good at budgeting, but we just didn't have the amount of money needed to do really a lot of improvements. And that kind of changed with the county 1-cent sales tax went in, and then a few years after that, the city adopted a 1-cent sales tax, and that was a huge boom to our local budget because we kept the county sales tax and we had the city sales tax, so that increased our coffers to the point where we could actually do street overlays, we could actually do road improvements, the things that government should be doing for their constituents, but whenever government is too poor, that's just not possible. So I had a number of road projects that I had to take care of, and during my term in office, the major projects I handled was, of course, the 2-ton loop came online. We built out the rural water district in our area. When I came into office, we served about 15 square miles of water service in our area when we were allowed to serve up to like 45 square miles. When I came into office, we were serving about 10 to 15 square miles. When I left office, we have served out our entire service area, which is about 45 square miles. That's one of the big things. The highway, I worked with the highway department closely on the highway between Siloam and Gentry. There was an average, that old Highway 59 from Siloam to Gentry, there was an average of about 2 to 3 deaths annually on that stretch between Siloam and Gentry. And so I worked with Jonathan Barnett, highway commissioner, and got a project through that made it a 4-lane highway from Siloam to Gentry. Since that time, we went from an average of 2 deaths per year, and over the 13 to 14 years that it's been open, I believe we've only had 2 to 3 deaths. And so we've managed to save the lives of 20 people or more. And when government can save lives, that's huge. So that project, I don't care what it cost, it was not an outrageously expensive project. But when you're saving lives, that's what government should be doing. So that's one of the projects I did: the library project, rural water project, the highway project, and then of course all of the other daily duties. Of course we had the water project what we call west, which is everything from Fairmount Road to the Oklahoma line, and then we had what we called the Rural Water Project East, which was mostly the Springtown area east of Fairmount Road. So we did it in two projects because we didn't have enough participation in the Springtown area to start out. Even though it was all funded as one project, we had to cut out that area, move ahead with the big project area, and then we came back and picked up the smaller project area as we went out and beat the bushes and got more active participation in people who really wanted the project to succeed. So these projects succeed because the people that need the rural water are willing to bend over backwards to do whatever they can to make it happen. And so I attribute that not to the city government, but mostly the people, the city government doing the people's will.
Let's talk about some of the regional meetings you used to go to.
Okay.
You talked earlier about the 2-ton, the
Yes.
group of cities that buy water get water from Beaver Lake. What about the Northwest Arkansas Council and kind of the role they took there was a time I remember when we were trying to get 49 in and 412 and an airport. There was kind of three projects going in.
Yes.
What
And
do you
that,
remember about the planning and how that all happened?
well, that was largely my part, of course. During the early planning stages of whenever I came into office, that's whenever we didn't have a Highway 49. We didn't. That was all still in the planning stages, very much like the 2-ton water system. When I came into office, the 2-ton water system was in the early stages, hadn't come online yet, and most of the planning, the results that we're seeing nowadays, was still in the early planning stages. So the Northwest Arkansas Council was heavily involved in that. The Northwest Arkansas Regional Planning Commission was heavily involved in that. I sat on the Northwest Arkansas Regional Planning, and I'll say this, that it's nice to see, whenever you're sitting on those commissions and boards, and you're seeing these, what I would say seem like pie in the sky dreams. We would like to have a highway here. We would like to have a huge water system there. We'd like to have an airport. Those seem like pipe dreams. But now looking back, it's a wonderful experience that now I get to see all those things that I was in on the ground floor of just pie in the sky dreams. Now they're a reality in Northwest Arkansas, and it's a benefit to everybody that lives here. Like there's still some things that have not come to fruition, but I'll tell you some of the ones that was really difficult, and a lot of it was funding related, which goes back to the highway department, and the highway commission did a great job of figuring out how to fund Highway 49. Now you can take a straight shot from Kansas City to Fort Smith, and it's you never have to get off. Unfortunately, it doesn't go through Bella Vista anymore, but that's what they wanted. They chose their destiny, but it's a freeway straight through Northwest Arkansas now. The airport, huge benefit for everybody that lives around here, and sitting in those meetings, and of course they've got a lot of smart people working on those projects, but you just say, I remember thinking to myself, man, there's such a massive amount of money, such a massive amount of planning, and yet municipalities and counties and regions pulling together, they can accomplish some mighty amazing things. And that's pretty much the story of Benton County. Is through the years, active public servants have done a very good job of providing critical infrastructure to make all of our lives much more wonderful today. I look back at what my life is like now compared to what it was like living in Gentry in 1959, and the difference is amazing. Now I would say that when I walk down Main Street, Gentry, I don't say, this is a nice little town, but it'd be nice if somebody would fix it up, which is what I used to think to myself when I was a kid walking around the streets. I'd say, man, this place really needs to be cleaned up. I don't have to think that anymore because it's a nice small town, and most of the cities in Benton County and up and down the 59 corridor, they're all going through a revitalization, all because of the same things. You've got better employment opportunities, and you have better funding opportunities, and as a result, we're all benefiting from the hard work that our public servants have done before us. I'm not taking credit for any of this. A lot more public service happened long before I ever came into office. I was just doing a job. I was just kept my head down, tried to do my job to the best of my ability with the talents that God gave me. And luckily, it's all worked out for the best.
Um, Now, as mayor is a nonpartisan position.
That's correct, yeah. And in the state of Arkansas, all municipal elections are run on a nonpartisan basis. So,
But one of the things we've asked the interviewees about is, and it may not have affected you, but at one time, Benton County was like the whole state of Arkansas, and every county was Democratic controlled. But
yes,
Benton County was essentially the first, what we would now call red county.
mm-hmm.
And a lot of people say it was because of people moving in from other areas,
Mhm.
maybe Bella Vista, or business owners
Mm-hmm.
like Daisy or Walmart people coming
Right,
in.
right.
So, what, did you notice? Did you notice any switch there? Do you remember that, or were you not really involved in that?
Well, having elections run on a nonpartisan basis on municipal elections, I believe is a wonderful thing. And when it comes to administration on a local level, uh, in the city of Gentry, because that's where my experience lies, this is the way I can characterize it. In a small town, when you have very limited budget and you're struggling to rub two nickels together, uh, there doesn't seem to be any room for partisanship because everybody agrees we need to pave the street. And so the focus becomes not if you're a Republican or a Democrat, but how are we going to pave that street? And everybody, it doesn't matter if you're a Republican or Democrat, everybody has to rise to the challenge to meet the work that has to be done. And so from my perspective, I wasn't involved in Republican politics. I wasn't involved in Democrat politics. I was kind of just a bystander watching it all go by because I had my head down, focused on what is the work at hand. And on the makeup of my council, I knew who were Republicans and who were Democrats, and we all worked together seamlessly. It was a whenever you are trying to make ends meet, it seems to foster a lot more cooperation when you don't have quite enough money to fill the bill and everybody has to pull their own weight and work together to figure it out. That's a wonderful thing. So I would say in small town politics, there's not room for partisanship because you don't have enough money for partisanship. So there's not any pork barrel politics because there's no pork barrel. If you take away a lot of the money, everybody puts their head down and goes to work, and politics falls by the wayside, or at least partisan politics falls by the way. It's all politics because you're still dealing with government agencies. You still have to figure out where the money comes from and where's the money going to go. But I was just more of a bystander during that whole period of time. Of course, I knew people who were heavily into the political world, but that wasn't what I was about. My focus was locally paying attention to Gentry first, and of course, nobody's an island. So I was part of the cooperative effort for the improvement of the entire area and of Benton County. So even though I was involved in the regional planning, I was not involved in the partisan makeup of the electorate.
If someone came to you, say someone who'd never been to Benton County,
Yeah.
and they said, "Hey, tell me about Benton County. What's it like?" What would you tell them?
I'd say it's a great place to live. There's a lot of, the wonderful thing is nowadays people can say things that they couldn't say in the 50s and 60s. Yeah, it's a great place to live, and there's a lot of opportunity. That's something I can say without any hesitation at all. It's a great place to live, and there is a lot of economic opportunity. There's a lot of job opportunities, even though it may not be. There's a lot of opportunities in Gentry proper, but there's also a lot of opportunities in Decatur, in Gravette, in Siloam, all of Northwest Arkansas. Northwest Arkansas, I view it more of even though this is not the way the government characterizes it, they characterize the urbanized district over on the 540 corridor in Springdale, Fayetteville, and Rogers and Bentonville. That's what they think is the urbanized area. But I look as the whole Benton County area as one one metropolitan area basically, and Gentry just happens to be the suburbs. So I lost my train of thought on that.
That's all right. So here's one other thing. You did a good job on that one. So, and how would you finish this sentence? My favorite thing about Benton County is.
Well, I'd have to give you a shopping list.
Okay.
My favorite thing about Benton County is the whole county has a small town feel to it. The whole county is a welcoming place, and so even though I know people over in Springdale and Bentonville and Rogers, uh, it still has that same friendly flavor. And the best thing I like about it is it's a wonderful place to live. The people are wonderful, and the crime is practically non-existent if you compare it to other areas of the country. And so, to tell you the truth, I don't know why there's not more people flocking to Northwest Arkansas, because I know, I've been to most major cities. Some of them I will never go back to, but I don't understand why a person in Chicago is struggling so hard to make ends meet. If I was in that situation, I would pack up and come to Benton County in a second, because I know that as soon as I arrive, my life has improved tremendously. And that's not to say anything disparaging about Chicago. That lifestyle is just not for me, and I don't see how those folks make ends meet living in a high, expensive environment like that.
Anything else that I haven't asked about that you want to talk about?
Uh, in general, we could go on for days. Uh, uh, what interested me, especially whenever I was mayor, was the early development of the county, the influence that the railroad had, the influence that agricultural had, the influence that in 1960 or 1965, the face of Benton County is changed so much. And I like to think that where we are today is exactly where the leaders of that time would like to see us to be. I think we have fulfilled our destiny to the best of all possible scenarios. I can't think of anything about Benton County. I really can't think of anything that I think could or should be done better. So, if I was to say what's my favorite thing about Benton County is things are done right. Public servants are serving the population. That's exactly, you can't ask for anything more than that. But that's just my humble opinion. I believe that public servants should serve the public. And that's about as far as I can take that. I don't know how to add anything else to that.